The reason why this is particularly important is because in the days of the communication revolution, back when we were talking about the Arab Spring in Tunisia, or the Orange Revolution, the Rose Revolution in the former Soviet republics, then we were talking about smartphones empowering individuals to learn more, undermining authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. The idea that North Korea wouldn't be able to last long because they just couldn't stand up to all this information coming into their country. But today, it's not the communications revolution. Today, it's the data revolution. It's the surveillance revolution. Today, it's not bottom up, it's top down. It's the power of those that have the data, that can aggregate it, and that can surveil, which actually strengthens these authoritarian models. It strengthens China as a state capitalist country with the ability to export their technology models to other countries through Belt and Road, for example, countries like Pakistan and Zimbabwe and the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Palantir exporting their surveillance model in the United States to the Saudis, also very smart for them, or the Israelis exporting their surveillance models to an...
So he's talking about like a current world is authoritarian world.
Right, more and more people, the gatekeepers,
not only China.
The gatekeepers that we were talking about before, they are now actually controlling the data. They're controlling the information. The reason why, it's not like a bottom up. It's not like free flow of information anymore. Now the person who has the power is the person who controls the data.
Oh, that's right. This is a kind of China. He's right. Like a IT company, they try to manipulate information, manipulate their data.
Right.
So they try to lead. If they're going to change program, they try to move into different direction. Right. Big threat for democratic world.
Definitely.
Number of Arab states, and working with the Chinese, which the Americans don't like, but the Israelis aren't doing very much about it, which doesn't get a lot of media because otherwise we've got a fantastic relationship with Israel. But it's important. So I do think the technology question, which I know you spent a lot of time studying, is really a very multifaceted one when it applies to political stability and where the world is going geopolitically.
So at this point in the conversation, I am cognizant of the fact there's a lot of negativity. I mean, the book is The Failure of Globalism, but I have to ask the question of whether or not there are any positive silver linings in the fact that globalism since the end of World War II really has been the reigning political ideology around the world, the interconnectedness of the world, free movement of goods and people and data information across borders. Or am I wrong? Is there no silver lining?
There are lots of silver linings, but let me explain why this book is negative. The book is...
What is silver lining?
The silver lining, is there no hope? Like basically, if there's a cloud, there's a silver lining, but it means that behind the cloud there is the sun. So the silver lining is basically telling us, oh, wait a minute, but there is also hope. Silver lining means hope.
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 No, I need to start with that, because if I were an economist...
On that poster behind her, she said the failure of globalism.
Yes.
This title is wrong.
And I were writing a book in 2008, at the end of 2008, in the teeth of the economic recession, the worst one that we had seen since the Great Depression, that would not be a positive book. That would be, wow, we need to get through this recession, and it's going to be really ugly, and a lot of people are going to get hurt, and if we don't do it well, it could be a depression. We're right now entering a geopolitical recession. They don't happen very often. Economic recessions happen on average every 6 to 7 years. Some are big, some are small, right? Geopolitical recessions are a much longer cycle. The last time we had a major geopolitical recession was World War II. It was a big one, it was the Depression. After World War II, the United States created a global order. Our institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, all of that, they sound global. World Bank sounds global. World Series sounds global too, right? I mean, there's a Canadian team. It ain't global, right? We're pretty clear on that. So the fact is that basically we are now witnessing an unwind of the US-led global order. And geopolitically, that's going to be a period of political volatility and uncertainty and pain. So that's not positive. Like, you can't spin an economic recession as awesome. I'm so glad that we're going to lose 10% of our net worth. Now, I think it is better that we are experiencing this geopolitical recession now than if it waited for 10 or 20 more years, because the bubble would have been bigger, China would be more powerful, the United States would have greater inequalities that we wouldn't have addressed. We have a better shot of dealing with this more effectively. That is one silver lining. There's a bigger silver lining, but it's mixed. And this is the one people need to think about. Is that the United States is not in decline, in my view. We are not at all. We have now outstripped every other country, the Saudis and the Russians, in global energy production. We're the largest in the world because of the energy revolution. We're the largest food producer in the world. We have the most extraordinary entrepreneurs and big companies developing the coolest breakthrough technologies in the world. The AI are a tech superpower, but we're still number one, right? And we live in the Western Hemisphere, where you don't get the refugees into the United States. You don't get the terrorists coming in. We create them sometimes, but we don't get them coming in, right? We got Canada, we got Mexico, we got oceans, right? Awesome. So, I mean, if you, and the dollar's the global reserve currency, and frankly, I mean, in a world that's becoming much more unstable, the dollar as the global reserve currency in the near term is probably going to get stronger, not weaker, because we will be seen as a cleaner, dirty shirt, right? We will be seen as a safe haven. So that's great, and we need to appreciate how incredibly fortunate our situation is. And that's before we talk about displacement from AI, which will affect poorer countries much worse than us. That's before we talk about climate, which affects equatorial Africa and the Middle East and all those people going to Europe more than it affects us, or Bangladesh or India more than it affects us, right? I mean, this is a great place. I mean, if you had to pick a time to live in the United States, the next 20 years is when you want to be in the US, right? Because other places, really bad, right? Other places of scale. Other places of scale. Yeah, Canada will be a little bit better, sure, but I mean, other places of scale, right? But it's the fact that the one country that could do the most to respond to this geopolitical recession is the one that has the least urgency to it, because we're the least affected by it. That means it's going to get worse for everybody else. It means that this is going to be much harder to respond to. So is that a silver lining? I mean, you know, if you'd asked me 30, 40 years ago to write a piece on climate change, I'm not sure that I would be talking about silver linings, right? I mean, I just think, again, we have to be honest about it. The big silver lining is we're here. The big silver lining is existential. Isn't it extraordinary that we can even have this conversation? And we can have it in America. Like, that's the big silver lining. And anyone that gets angry or that complains, I mean, if my mother's not with us anymore, but I mean, if she were and she saw me complaining, she'd beat me upside the head, given every opportunity that she afforded me.
I don't understand what he is talking about.
So basically, the question was, okay, so this is kind of negative, the whole thing about globalism. But isn't there a silver lining? Isn't there a silver lining about our future? He says, well, yeah, there is a silver lining. If this would we are in a geopolitical recession, that means the United States is retreating from the central position it had in the world, and that means that there will be a time of turbulence within the next 10, 20 years when power vacuum is being filled and people are so that there's instability. But actually the silver lining is that if it would happen 20 years later, then America would have been even more unstable, because there would be more disenfranchised people, and that we would be not in an economic situation, but China would have been stronger. So the silver lining is that it's happening now and not 20 years later. And another silver lining is that actually the United States is much better equipped to deal with this than other countries. So other countries are facing problems with global warming and AI revolution, they are much they're in a much weaker position to deal with these changes. Therefore, actually, the silver lining is that it happens now, and it happens to us because basically we don't have so much to worry about compared to other countries. They're in much deeper shit.
What do you mean? Why don't worry about it?
Well, no, we worry about it, but actually, relatively speaking, our problems are not that big. Look at people outside of the United States; their problems are much bigger.
Oh, I see. Much bigger.
So, and the problem would have been bigger if it would have waited another 20 years. It's good that it's happening now, because now actually this change in power balance. At the moment, we're still stronger than China, but if it would have happened 20 years later, then if there was a closer power balance, then it could have been much worse.
Much worse.
Yeah.
20 years later,
Yeah.
China will going to
Would have been much stronger, and then it would have been much more difficult to address it.
Right, and that's kind of true of everybody in this room, especially in global context, right? So I don't think we deserve many silver linings after that, if I'm being honest about it.
Thanks.
Okay, so from the failures of globalism, I wanted to move to the second part on the title of your book, the us versus them. And how does globalism lead to this polarization that we see in the US? And you've spoken to that a little bit, but how do you see it playing out in the future?
What do you mean by that?
So in some sense, we have globalism, and then we have the people, the winners and the losers, and they're increasingly pulled apart, and they're in opposition to each other. And so we're basically split up into two countries. And is there a way of bringing them together again, or do you see that just becoming worse and worse until things become so bad that we need to create things from scratch again?
So downside and upside. Let's start with downside. Downside is right now our economy is doing well. The market's doing well. Unemployment is comparatively low. Growth is pretty good in the US and globally. If we feel this disenfranchised in an upcycle, when the economy gets softer and there's not as much fiscal flexibility to blow out on tax benefits and everything else, it's going to get worse, right? And we also really aren't investing in solutions right now, right? So, I mean, William Gibson has this wonderful quote I've always liked. Many of you know William Gibson, the fantastic science fiction author. It is, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, right? So, I mean, we're right now talking about, I mean, Israel's having elections literally today. They just, the polls just closed a couple of hours ago. And Netanyahu promised that if he was made prime minister, he would start formally annexing some of the territories in the West Bank that he's been informally annexing for some time. You know, you've also got the Golan Heights that Trump just said is yours. I mean, look, Israel is an amazing democracy. It might be one of the most functional democracies in the world to live in. There's virtually no corruption. It's an incredible free media. It's an independent judiciary. It's great rule of law. It's a fantastic educational system. Even the Arabs living in Israel increasingly think of themselves, identify as Israelis, larger percentages every year. It's pretty awesome, as long as you're not Palestinian in the occupied territories, right? Now you could say, wait a second, what do you mean as long as? Well, yeah, as long as you're not Palestinian. Now, there are a lot of Palestinians. And in Gaza in particular, unemployment's 50%, and there are no meaningful opportunities, and that's why a lot of them are actually throwing themselves at a border that is a hell of a lot more dangerous than the US-Mexico border, where the Israeli Defense Forces have orders to shoot using lethal force if someone tries to breach it, and people die, right? Now, you got to be pretty distraught to get to the point, not that you're going to vote for Trump, or you're going to vote for Brexit, or you're not going to bother to vote, but you're going to throw yourself against that border. I believe that the Israel-Palestine divide is something we will increasingly experience in parts of advanced industrial democracies, right? That is
Okay, why he is talking about Palestine, Israel, and Mexican border?
Because these are examples of where the divide between the winners and the losers is becoming most visible. So the division, the difference between sorry, yeah, I'm cold, so I I retreat a little bit. So the difference between Israel and people who live in the Gaza, where there's 50% unemployment, becomes so big that the divide between the two becomes so big that it becomes more and more visible. People are trying to get into Israel. They are trying to break through the border, and that means that people inside Israel, who are the ones who have the winners, they are going to build bigger borders and taller fences in order to protect what they have, and this will lead to a bigger divide. But these kinds of divides will become more and more visible in the years to come, because the system is developing in a system where there's a small group of winners and there's a large group of losers. So there will be more and more conflict within the future societies.
The bad news. The good news is I actually am starting to see real experimentation on the part of mayors, governors, CEOs, Bill Gates, Mike Bloomberg, Steve Case, and not just Americans, people all over the world, to try to think about what we can do to address the fact that the social contract increasingly does not work for a lot of people. Universal basic income. Don't know if that's the right answer. I'm a little skeptical. We can talk about why if you want. But the fact is we don't have enough data. So the fact that we're doing an experiment in Stockton, California, we'll see. The fact that there's a state in India that's actually doing an experiment with like 4 or 6 million people, we'll see. The Congress Party, which isn't going to win, but nonetheless that UBI is a part of their basic, mandate. The fact that you've got Bernie Sanders and AOC and others talking about it. I mean, there's also in Denmark right now, they're doing experiments around flex time, experiments around the gig economy. That would provide you've got higher corporate taxation, but much easier for corporations to hire and fire at will. In return, much deeper social safety net for individuals, men and women. You've got AT&T funding universal lifetime training for anyone that works for AT&T that they'll pay for. You have to do it on your time, but if you do it, they make sure that you're upskilled to get new jobs that you need, because otherwise you get displaced. I love the fact, and there are now, when I wrote the book, there were a bunch of these that I wrote about. But in the years since then, I've learned about 20 more. So this is starting to get attention. But it is early. These are small. We don't have the data. Again, let me give you the climate example. 30, 40 years ago, we didn't know it was going to work. Today, turns out solar power is cheaper than coal in the daytime. It's scalable. That's awesome. Now, to be clear.
Okay, well, this is 40 years ago. At that time, we don't have data. But
right.
Now we have.
No, not 40 years ago. He's moving on to a new. He was talking about climate change and solar power. But what he sees that when we talk about universal basic income, then we are still in very early stages. Does it work? I mean, does it mean, like what you were saying, that people will just stop working and the economy will come to a grinding halt and it's too expensive, and basically it will be one big disaster, the universal basic income? Or will the story narrative be different? At this moment, we do not know yet. We are still very much experimental to see, to look at the consequences of giving people a guaranteed basic income. We don't know yet whether it's feasible. There is not enough data. But then he compares it with climate change. Like 40 years ago, solar power. We talked about it, but it was maybe not feasible. But today, solar power during the daytime is actually cheaper than coal. So it has become feasible. Not the same if you apply that to universal basic income. We're talking about it right now. We're doing small experiments, and maybe in the future universal basic income will become a viable, it turns out to be a viable, feasible option to create more equality and stability within our society.